The first thing we gotta do is start off by thinking about knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. Because it looks like Russell is from the way that Russell presents it, that these are two different versions of the same thing. But what exactly is that thing? Russell is not as explicit about this as I would have liked. He's a little bit unclear about it, but here's the way that I like to think about what Russell is doing. I think what Russell is doing is asking the question of, when are we able to think about an object? So there are lots of things that we're able to think about. So I can think about myself, my family, my pets, this laptop. These are all things that are kind of in my immediate environment. But I can also think about a lot of other things too that I've never come into direct contact with. I can think about the planet Jupiter, or I can think about the equator, or I can think about the North Pole, or I can think about Kanye West or Taylor Swift. None of these things have I ever come into direct contact with. So there looks like there are two important categories of things there. There's the things we can think about because we've been in direct contact with them, and there are the things that we are able to think about somehow even though we've never encountered them in our lives. And this exactly, I think, is what Russell is getting at. What he wants to say is that in the first class of things, we know them by acquaintance. And in the second class of things, we're able to think about them because we know that certain descriptions apply to them. So let's think first about the case of acquaintance. What does it mean to be acquainted with something? A really important thing to note here is that while Russell he picks the word acquaintance deliberately because he wants his use of it to share some properties of the way that we use it in ordinary English, really he's introducing it with like a separate technical meaning. So he's using the word in a special way, and he doesn't mean exactly what normal people mean when they talk about acquaintance. Now his notions share some features of what we ordinarily mean when we use the word acquaintance, but really he's talking about something specific. So like this is like a piece of philosopher's jargon. Okay, but what is acquaintance then? Well, let me just start by reading you what Russell himself says about it. So Russell says that I'm acquainted with an object when I have a direct cognitive relation to that object, i.e. when I am directly aware of the object itself. When I speak of a cognitive relation here, I do not mean the sort of relation which constitutes judgment, but rather which constitutes presentation. So the general idea is that you're acquainted with some object whenever it's in some sense presented to you. Now, Russell doesn't really define what he means by something's being presented to you, but he focuses on a couple of examples. And there are basically like two ways we're really only going to talk about objects being directly presented to you. So acquaintance is going to break down into two cases. There's the case of perception, and there's the case of introspection. So really, acquaintance just generally comes in two kinds. So let's focus on perception first. Here, Russell is just using the word in the normal terms. So basically he thinks when you perceive something, that's a way for you to be acquainted with an object. If you look around the room and you spot something yellow, you're perceiving that something is yellow, you're going to be acquainted with the color yellow, because the color yellow is directly presented to you through your senses. Most of us would be inclined to think when we perceive things like maybe we can perceive objects, like we can perceive a table, we can perceive chairs, we can perceive our computers and things like that. If you think those really are the kinds of things you directly perceive, then you would say you're also acquainted with these objects directly. Now, in a moment I'm going to talk about why Russell himself doesn't think about things that way. But we're going to, when we're thinking about it, be more generous in thinking about the kinds of things we think we can be directly aware of. So for the time being, we'll assume that basically anything that appears to you in perception is something that you can be acquainted with. That covers one case. What about the case of introspection? Well, Russell's thinking that so for instance, we know lots of things about our own minds. If you prick me with a pin and I have a pain, then, well, I know in some sense directly that I'm in pain. I don't sort of figure out that I'm in pain by looking at my leg and thinking, oh, given how my leg is moving, I must be in pain. I know I'm in pain because I feel like I'm in pain. I feel the pain. Now, arguing that case is not necessarily a case of perception. Perception is usually thought of as a way to be aware of how things are in the outside world, not in the inside world. But pain really is something that kind of happens in the inside world. So this might be a case where we say, well, we're aware through something like introspection that we're in pain. So we're going to use the word introspection. To introspect is sort of to be directly aware of some mental property that you have in a sort of direct way. So one thing that you might be able to introspect or be aware of through introspection or be acquainted with through introspection is something like a pain. Likewise, Russell thinks that, well, we're just aware of ourselves. We're directly acquainted with ourselves through introspection. Ourselves are sort of directly presented to us. Now, of course, they're not directly presented through us through perception, because it's external objects we're presented with through perception. So there just must be this other way in which things can be presented to us. And again, that's what we're going to call introspection. So you can think of introspection as sort of like the internal analog of perception. Perception is for being directly acquainted with things outside of you. Introspection is for being directly acquainted with things inside of you. Again, I should say that Russell himself wouldn't actually be completely happy with that way of talking about things for reasons that we're going to talk about in a moment. But for now, that's the way that you should think about it until we talk about what the complication is. Something that's important to add as well is that it's not just like objects that we're acquainted with through perception and introspection, but we're both acquainted with objects and with properties as well. So external objects we're acquainted with through perception, but also external properties. What do I mean here? Well, clearly ordinary things, or normally we'd be inclined to say ordinary things like tables and chairs are things that we perceive and that we're directly aware of. But remember the example I started with, the example of the color yellow. Now, the color yellow is not an object, or it's not an object in the same sense that a table is. The color yellow is not like something that can sit on the table in addition to the pens that are yellow. However it exists in a sort of different way. But nonetheless, you might think, well, the color is directly presented to you through perception. You are acquainted with the color through perception. But since the color is not just an ordinary object, if you think the color is directly presented to you through perception, you must think that there is more than just objects that are presented through perception. Rather, sometimes properties are presented as well. And if you think about it, there's a whole range of other properties that will be presented as well. So maybe what shape something is, maybe how heavy something is. Lots of other properties are going to be presented to us through perception. In fact, the same happens with introspection. So we saw an example of an object that's presented through introspection. Well, just yourself. You're acquainted with yourself through introspection. But we also saw the example of pain. We often talk about specific pains, but there's also the property of just pain or being in pain. And you might think, well, this is something that you are directly aware of, not through perception, but rather through introspection. So again, just like in the case of perception, you can be acquainted with both objects and properties through introspection. I say that because it's going to be really important later on that we actually can be acquainted with both of these kinds of things. So that's the acquaintance part. Now we haven't given a definition of acquaintance, but basically Russell is telling us what acquaintance is by giving us a bunch of examples of it. So when you perceive something, that's a way of being acquainted with something. When you introspect something, that's a way of being acquainted with something. Maybe we're not able to really give a definition, or at least a reductive definition of what acquaintance is. But clearly we can see that there's something kind of importantly similar in these cases. There's some idea of an object being presented in different ways. And that's exactly what Russell is getting at with acquaintance. So even if it's not a definition, I think it is enough to give us a pretty good grasp on what acquaintance is supposed to be, or at least for now. But what about description? So we said that at the beginning there's this large class of examples where We're in some sense able to think about the objects even though we've never encountered them. Why are we able to do that? Well, here Russell's idea is that, well, the reason we're able to think about these objects is because, as he says, we know them by description. And what that means is that we know that a certain description applies to them. So here, more officially, is kind of the formulation that Russell gives. You know X by description, just in case, for some F, you know X is the F. And this looks right when we think about the kinds of examples we started with. So remember Jupiter. In some sense, I'm able to think about Jupiter, have thoughts about Jupiter, even though I've never been to Jupiter, presumably never will go to Jupiter. The reason is because I know it's, the biggest planet in the solar system, it's the one with the big red spot on it, so on. I know some facts about it that uniquely pick it out. The same goes for a case like Mark Twain. I've never directly encountered Mark Twain, or presumably never will, unless I develop time travel. Nonetheless, I'm able to think about Mark Twain because I know him by description. I know that he's the author of Huckleberry Finn. Finally, I'm able to think about Kanye West, even though, I've never encountered him, and it's never been directly presented to me. Because again, I know him by description. I know that, for instance, he's the guy who interrupted Taylor Swift at some music awards. So this is the other major way in which you might be able to think about something. And this, Russell thinks, is the category that explains most of what we're able to think about, in fact. So very few of the things that we think about, or very few of the things that we could think about, are things that we're directly acquainted with. Most of them are things that we know by description. We're able to think about them because we know some description applies to them.